Good morning, everybody. I think we are going to go ahead and get started. I want to welcome you to today's webinar, Race and Equity in Child and Family Serving Systems, presented by Brenda J. Allen. This webinar is hosted by the California Evidence-Based Clearinghouse for Child Welfare, commonly referred to as the CEBC. My name is Molly Dino. I'm the CEBC Content Specialist, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Next slide, please. Before I introduce our presenter, I would like to review a few webinar logistics and some background info on the CEBC. First, the audio controls are at the bottom left-hand side of the Zoom screen. We've muted attendees, but you can still test your audio, connect, and select what speakers or headphone you would like to use. We will not be using the raise hand feature during this webinar. If you have questions for the presenter or the CEBC during the webinar, you can submit them using the Q&A pod at the bottom of the screen in front of you. We will save your presenter questions for the questions portion at the end of the presentation. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be archived on the CEBC website for anyone to view within the next few days, along with the PowerPoint slides and any relevant handouts. You will receive an email when the recording is posted. Lastly, at the end of the webinar, you will be directed to take a brief feedback survey so that the CEBC can improve our webinars and make them as useful and relevant as possible. You will also receive an email with a link to the survey shortly after the conclusion of this webinar. At the end of the survey, there will be an opportunity to download a certificate of attendance. Next slide, please. For those not familiar with the CEBC, the majority of our work can be found on our publicly accessible website, cebc4cw.org, where we review the evidence for about 500 practices relevant to children, youth, and parents involved or at risk for involvement in the child welfare system. The CEBC currently has programs in 50 unique topic areas, such as mental health, parent training, anger management, substance abuse, and many other areas relevant to child welfare. Anyone can access and explore the information and materials on the CEBC website, and we encourage you to do so if you haven't already. The CEBC is funded by the California Department of Social Services, Office of Child Abuse Prevention, and operated by the Chadwick Center for Children and Families at Rady Children's Hospital in San Diego, California. Next slide, please. And now I'd like to introduce our presenter. Brenda J. Allen, PhD, Professor Emerita, is a former Chief Diversity Officer at the University of Colorado, Denver, and the Anschutz Medical Campus. She has developed a track record for leadership, scholarship, teaching, and training related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. She is committed to helping others develop more inclusive, humane, and equitable communication and professional practices. Dr. Allen offers workshops, facilitations, and keynote speeches on topics such as inclusive leadership, inclusion in the workplace, strategic planning, implicit bias, and diversity recruitment retention practices. Among her numerous publications is a groundbreaking book entitled Difference Matters: Communicating Social Identity. And now, Brenda, I will let you move on with the presentation.
Thank you very much, Molly. Hello, everyone. I commend you for taking time to attend this webinar. I deeply appreciate you for your commitment to serving children and families. Now, I agreed to present this webinar in December of 2019. I could never in my wildest imagination have anticipated what would happen in our world to affect what I would share with you. First, the COVID-19 pandemic early this year, which magnified the need to focus on race and equity in child and family serving systems. As employees within those systems worked to address that need, they also had to adjust their ways of working. Then on May 25th, George Floyd was brutally murdered, sparking unprecedented worldwide protests. Due to these major developments, I revised this presentation to focus on race and anti-racism, topics that many people seem sincerely interested in understanding. To set the stage for our time together, I want to begin with a story. One Monday morning in July 2016, I went to work as usual, but my heart wasn't in it. I was feeling the cumulative pain and anxiety of police officer-involved killings of Black people, the Orlando nightclub massacre of mainly queer people of color, and the murder of police officers in Dallas. As I sat at my desk trying to collect my emotions, Chancellor Dorothy Harrell appeared in my doorway. "Do you have a minute?" she asked. "Of course," I responded. "I just wanted you to know that I've been thinking about you," she began. "During church yesterday, Father referred to the recent murders, and it dawned on me that this all must be very hard for you. I feel badly, but I can't imagine how you feel. I want you to know that I value you very much, and I'm grateful for all that you do for so many of us on this campus." "Thank you," she said, and she left. "Thank you," I said, and she left. That interaction took me by surprise. It was the first time that I can recall in almost 30 years of being in higher education that a white colleague ever said anything to me at work about racial events in the world in such a personal way. It was especially notable coming from the leader of the campus. This moment between the chancellor and me was what I call an affirming interaction. I will explain this concept and recommend it as one way to accomplish the goals for this presentation. My goals today are: one, to describe how to cultivate more inclusive workplaces with an emphasis on race and equity. And two, to inspire you to become more committed to cultivating inclusive, equitable, anti-racist workplaces. I'm going to focus on workplace interactions between employees in child and family serving systems. To honor the times in which we find ourselves, I will foreground race and anti-racism, even as I acknowledge that other aspects of identity overlap or intersect with race in meaningful ways. These include gender, social class, age, nationality, ability, to name a few. I will begin by defining terms. I realize that you probably already have definitions of these terms. However, meanings vary, and sometimes people have incomplete or inaccurate understandings. I'd rather almost insult you by sharing something that you thoroughly understand and could better explain than I will, than to miss an opportunity to clarify meaning for someone who doesn't know, especially because in these days, people are using terms like racism, anti-racism, anti-Black racism, et cetera. I just want to be sure that we're clear on what they mean. I'm not going to linger on those definitions, however. You will have the slides to consult along with the sources from which I got them. After that, I will share recommendations for how to cultivate inclusion at organizational and individual levels. Then you will create an individual action plan. We will close with the Q&A period. With this statement of goals and overview of the session in mind, I now invite you to set your intention. Given what's going on in the world and in your lives, it might be easy to be distracted or to engage on a surface level. That's why I'd like you to set an intention, to write a statement about how you would like to think, feel, or engage in your learning for what you hope to gain. As you prepare to set your intention, please bring your attention to your heart, perhaps placing your hand there, and take a deep breath. Relax and sit with an open, receptive posture. Now, take a moment to create your intention. Thank you. Please keep this in mind throughout our time together. Would you like to know my intention? Oh, that's right, I can't hear you. Well, I'm just going to assume somebody said yes, so I'm going to share mine. My intention is to equip, empower, and encourage you to become much more committed to cultivating an inclusive, anti-racist, equitable workplace than you already are. As we go forward, I also have an intention, especially in the Q&A period, to learn from you the kinds of concerns and interests you have so that I can better do my work. Next, let's see who's here.
Okay, so now I will pull up one of the polls so that everybody can let us know. Still have some votes coming in. What is your position type? Direct service, supervisor, manager, administrative support, director, organizational leader, or other? We still have a few more coming in. Okay, so it looks like we have 33% direct service, 27% supervisor and manager, 5% administrative support, 11% director, organizational leader, and 25% other. Okay, now I'll end this poll.
Okay. Now let's learn the service sector you work in.
Okay, and so we're asking what service sector do you work in? Child welfare, juvenile justice, mental health, legal services, community-based provider like CASA or housing, etc., academic or research, or other.
Well, as you conclude that poll, I want to tell you I'm so grateful to have such a wide representation of roles and contexts.
Still have a couple answers coming in. All right, it looks like we have about 53% child welfare, 4% juvenile justice, 14% mental health. We have 8% community-based provider, 5% academic research, and 15% other. So we'll go ahead and close the poll now.
Excellent. Thank you again. I really appreciate that you have taken time out of, I'm sure, busy schedules for this webinar today. To continue, let's start with reviewing key terms. I'm going to start with inclusion. Now, what do you think of when I say inclusion? During face-to-face training, I often ask participants to do a word association, and they respond by putting their answers into technology that allows me then to generate a word cloud. Their answers always reveal that inclusion is a complex concept that evokes positive and negative meanings and feelings. Here's a word cloud of terms from a group I worked with last year. In case you're not aware, the size of a word or phrase represents how many times someone listed it. For this group, more people wrote respect than any other word. Right behind that were belonging and acceptance, welcoming, openness. Study the cloud for a moment to identify negative terms that they came up with as well. Do you see lowering standards, uncomfortable, forced, political correctness, white is bad, disruptive? As you strive for inclusion, it's important to remember that some people may have these negative kinds of connotations of the term. Our definition of inclusion is that everyone in the workplace feels respected and valued. This simple definition addresses two common perspectives on inclusion. Inclusion often seems to refer either to everyone, regardless of their identity, as in the human race, or it refers to individuals and groups who historically have been and currently might be excluded or marginalized due to explicit and implicit discrimination. Our definition encompasses both of these perspectives at the same time. The goal is to create and maintain workplaces where members of underrepresented or minoritized groups and members of well-represented or majority groups feel respected and valued. This means that in some cases, we need to attend to specific groups to be equitable. It requires being responsible and flexible regarding where and when we might focus more on underrepresented or minoritized groups than majority groups, even as we strive to be aware of everyone. Please note that inclusion is both a process and a feeling. Inclusion encompasses actions that intend, quote unquote, to include, and an emotional outcome, quote, I feel included, end quote. To get more insight, let's look at factors of inclusion. Factors of inclusion are based on research from inclusion in the workplace: value, belonging, uniqueness, respect, equity. So pause for a moment and just look at those and think about what they might mean and what they mean to you specifically. As I go through these, I want you to remember that at the conclusion of today, you're going to create an action plan. And I want you to fully engage the material so you're aware of what they mean to you, as well as what they mean in terms of how you might cultivate more inclusive, equitable, and anti-racist workplace. So let's look briefly at each of these. The first one is value. Value refers to having worth. Individuals feel valued when others treat them like they are important and useful. Individuals' sense of worth in the workplace may correspond with societal views of their racial identity, and employees may implicitly or explicitly draw upon those views as they interact with one another. In general, how valued do you tend to feel in the workplace? And how do you help others feel valued in the workplace? The second factor is belonging. Belonging refers to feeling accepted. Employees feel a strong sense of belonging when others seem to accept them as they are, when they can be their authentic selves, when colleagues genuinely include them in formal and informal networks. Employees with a strong sense of belonging do not feel like a very different person at work than at home. Employees who do not have a sense of belonging may feel like they have to act very differently at work than they do at home. People of color frequently face challenges to conform to norms based on dominant racial ideologies, such as formal and informal guidelines about communication styles and appearance. They may also work hard not to fit stereotypes about their racial identities. And they may not be as likely to be invited, especially to informal networking opportunities that often are the source for advancing in the organization. One research study found that Black employees created what they called, quote, facades of conformity, unquote, to try to fit in more frequently than other racially minoritized groups. And they felt more inauthentic. Perhaps you've heard the term imposter syndrome, as well as the process known as covering, where you kind of mask who you are in order to try to fit in. The next factor is uniqueness. The dictionary definition of uniqueness is a state or condition wherein someone or something is unlike anything else in comparison. This factor emphasizes appreciating each person as one of a kind. It also means valuing someone for multiple attributes. That is, not to view them only as one or two parts of their identity. This matters to members of all racial groups in the workplace. Research shows that some white men are concerned that others view them only by their race and gender, which can affect their involvement in diversity and inclusion efforts. Worried that they might be vilified, they may opt out or not fully engage. Ironically, their ability to easily opt out may be connected to their race and gender privilege. People of color also struggle with being seen as unique and multidimensional. Many of them report feeling viewed only by their racial identity and being treated as if everyone in their racial group is the same. In terms of uniqueness, how well do you believe you are seen as unique within your workplace? And how do you help others see that they are their unique attributes and help them to contribute them? The next factor of inclusion is RESPECT. I like this dictionary definition, quote, due regard for the feelings, wishes, rights, or traditions of others, end quote. Being respected in the workplace often tops lists of what matters most to employees. They especially want leaders to respect them. Meanings and manner of displaying respect vary. They can be based on cultural differences. As you know, eye contact is a sign of respect in Western cultures. In other cultures, and actually in some cultures within Western context, it's a sign of disrespect. In addition, what matters to one person may be insignificant to another. A common occurrence in many workplaces is when white people mistake one person of color for another. A woman of color who was repeatedly being mistaken for another woman of color on her job when I was a chief diversity officer told me that after she corrected a white colleague for the umpteenth time, that person responded, "Oh, that's right, you're the other one." This woman was quite frustrated with this ongoing behavior, while the woman of color for whom they mistook her shrugged it off. As these examples show, respect is often tied to communication. Individuals can feel disrespected when others question their authority, dismiss their concerns, ignore them, give others credit for something they did or said, mispronounce their name. Members of non-dominant racial groups may interpret instances of the previous examples as evidence that others devalue them due to their race. They just might be right. Some people are openly prejudiced. Others may have unconscious racial biases that affect their behaviors without them knowing it and contrary to their actual value systems. To add insult to injury, sometimes when people of color describe such experiences, their white colleagues brush them off or say that they are too insensitive. Meanings of respect may be related to socio-historical discrimination against groups. Take, for example, calling a Black man a boy. That's disrespectful because historically, white people routinely describe Black men as boys to suggest that they weren't on equal footing with white men. Videos and photos of the sanitation strike that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. led in Memphis in 1968 show many of the Black male protesters wearing signs saying, quote, "I am a man," exclamation point, end quote. The next factor of inclusion is equity. Equity refers to the effort to provide different levels of support based on an individual's or group's needs in order to achieve fairness in outcomes. Working to achieve equity acknowledges unequal starting places and the need to correct the imbalance. An equity approach to inclusion accepts and addresses this reality. This is different than equality, the effort to treat everyone the same. Equality ignores historical and structural factors that benefit some social groups and disadvantage other social groups. In a minute, I'm going to give you an example of inequitable treatment based on race. To conclude, 5 factors of inclusion are value, belonging, uniqueness, respect, and equity. To tie them together, I'm going to share another story. I once worked for an organization where I was the only Black woman and the only person of color, period, in my department. White colleagues and leaders often expected me to represent women, Black people, or women of color. They solicited information and guidance on race and gender issues. And this was well before I became a diversity and inclusion scholar practitioner, so their requests weren't related then to my area of expertise. They asked me to serve on committees or task forces to make them quote unquote diverse. They wanted me to attend after hours events. Basically, they expected me to be what a Harvard Business Review article calls, quote, a cultural ambassador, end quote, responsible for going beyond my job description to perform activities related not to my job. This highlights an important difference for me as a Black woman, contrasted with my white male colleagues who were not asked to represent their race and gender. I began to experience what later would be called, quote, diversity fatigue, which arose from constantly engaging in numerous activities related to my race and gender, many of which required emotional labor. And I can tell you, I'm experiencing that right now, even though I'm retired, in terms of so many people now rushing to learn more about racism, diversity, et cetera. So I know that my colleagues who do this work and also my colleagues who are in workplaces probably are experiencing something similar. So this was an example of inequitable treatment. I felt valued only as a twofer, someone for whom the organization could check 2 boxes, woman and person of color, to describe how diverse they were. This sentiment was compounded by times where white colleagues mistook me for another Black woman faculty member on campus, even though we looked nothing alike. Now notice that was way back in the 90s. The experience I described a moment ago was 2 years ago at an institution. So this idea of mistaking people for one another. In addition, my colleagues did not consult me about my actual area of expertise. I had been hired as a scholar of computer-mediated communication. Thus, they didn't consider I was a way I was unique that they knew about, and that was part of my job description. I could give you other examples of ways that I did not feel fully valued, respected, seen as unique, or treated equitably that I associate with my being a Black woman, but I don't have time. Suffice it to say that because of these and other experiences, I questioned whether I belonged in that organization. More important, my experiences are not unusual. A wealth of research exists that describes similar experiences for people of color in various workplace settings. Now that I have defined inclusion and explained 5 factors of inclusion, let's turn to definitions of other key terms, beginning with race. Notice that this quote refers to the fact that race is a social construction. Race labels are based more on political, cultural, and social processes than physical differences. You probably know that the Human Genome Project concluded that race does not correspond with biology and genetics. However, race as a concept has been and still is used to justify domination, exploitation, and violence against racial and ethnic minoritized groups. It also helps to promote a sense of superiority for the white race. In case you aren't aware of the history, across history, persons in power created racial hierarchies to stress the point of race as a social construction. Johann Friedrich Blumenbach is one example. He established the most influential of all racial classifications. He cited 5 races, declaring, quote, "I have allotted the first place to the Caucasian because this stock displays the most beautiful race of men," end quote. This hierarchy, based on an artificial construction, has very real consequences, key of which is racism. The set of definitions shown on this slide is crucial to understand. The fact that racism is systemic, not individualistic. It is supported and maintained both implicitly and explicitly by institutional structures and policies, cultural norms, and values. An abundance of data shows that racism yields racial inequities and disparities in every sector of private and public life, including politics, healthcare, criminal justice, education, income, employment, and home ownership. Anti-racism is an active process of identifying and challenging racism by changing systems, organizational structures, policies and practices, and attitudes to redistribute power in an equitable manner. Anti-racism calls for commitment and action beyond saying, quote, "I am not a racist," end quote. As you may know, numerous types of racism exist, including institutional, internalized, interpersonal, structural. I want to foreground anti-Black racism because we're hearing a lot about that these days. Anti-Black racism refers to any attitude, behavior, practice, or policy that explicitly or implicitly reflects the belief that Black people are inferior to another racial group. Anti-Black racism is reflected in interpersonal, institutional, and systemic levels of racism and is a function of white supremacy. I agree with those who contend that anti-Black racism is the root of most racial oppression and racism in the United States, and in fact, most oppression, period. Progress made against anti-Black racism will help to disrupt other types of racism. The final term is racial equity. Racial equity is really one of the things we're striving for through anti-racism, through fighting against anti-Black racism. Racial equity is the condition that would be achieved if one's racial identity no longer predicted in a statistical sense how one fares. I really appreciate this framing because it goes back to the idea that racism is systemic and it has systemic implications for quality of life. When we use the term racial equity, we're thinking about racial equity as one part of racial justice. And thus we also include work to address root causes of inequities, not just their manifestation. This includes elimination of policies, practices, attitudes, and cultural messages that reinforce differential outcomes by race or that fail to eliminate them. Now that we have these concepts and the ways that I mean them for today, let's now take a look at how to cultivate inclusive, equitable, anti-racist workplaces. Now, to make substantial progress, as you think about those definitions, it's going to be extremely important for organizations to take a systemic approach. They will need to strive to be strategic and have sustainable actions that transform the policies, procedures, practices, cultures, etc. Achieving this goal also necessitates individual actions, which is our focus for today. Let's look briefly at recommendations for organizational level actions before we delve into what you can do individually. This set of recommendations for organizations and institutions is based on proven practices, and that's part of the good news here. Almost anything organizations seek to do in terms of being anti-racist, inclusive, and more equitable, there are best and proven practices. It's just a matter of whether or not and how they commit to actually implementing them. So here are some ideas to make inclusion, equity, and anti-racism a priority, to embed and infuse that priority throughout the entire organization. And the strategic approach includes aligning with the organization's mission, vision, and values to specify and implement measurable, attainable, realistic, and timely goals. For example, analyze racial composition of the workplace to ascertain and correct patterns of discrimination that include who are the leaders, who's getting particular resources, what are the hiring practices? Are there programs in place to guarantee no matter who you are, you have an opportunity to advance, et cetera? As I said earlier, in terms of number 3, the good news is that a wealth of best and promising practices exist. Number 4, to work down, up, and across the hierarchy is crucial. This means also that senior leadership needs to be visible, vocal, explicitly involved, and demonstrating what they personally are doing, as well as requiring others to be accountable. Number 5 is to allocate resources to achieve the strategic goals that are set. And by the way, to provide tools so that people can succeed in terms of making the organization more inclusive, equitable, and anti-racist. So that could be professional development programs, mentoring, coaching, providing assessments of various types, and to avoid one and done training. I'm getting so many calls to provide training on topics such as anti-racism and implicit bias, a tactic that I strongly discourage. It's really much more important to do holistic programs that are ongoing. Number 6 is to hold everyone accountable. For example, through 360 evaluations that actually have implications for raises and promotions. Finally, number 7 is to acknowledge exemplary staff and units. This will demonstrate that you value them and what they do. It will also model for others how to affect change. Now, with those recommendations at the organizational and institutional level in mind, and by the way, I need to reiterate that in order to make any substantial, sustainable change when it comes to anti-racism, inclusion, and equity in the workplace, it's going to require deep commitment, lots of hard work, and this has to be systemic. So with that in mind, however, there are things that you as an individual can do, both in the meantime as these plans are being developed and implemented, and also once they are in place. So the first thing is to take personal responsibility. I want you to pause for a moment and think about, just from what we've shared, as well as what possibly has been on your mind and in your heart, especially recently anyway, about how are you already showing personal responsibility, and what else might you do? The second is to become more mindful. Some of the kinds of behaviors that I described earlier in terms of whether or not and how, especially people of color, feel included and feel that they're treated equitably in the workplace, are things that once others are aware that these are possibilities, your perceptions change. You have a different lens. So being mindful then of these kinds of dynamics of your behaviors and attitudes as well as others is really going to make a difference in terms of what you personally can do. In other words, I want you to treat anti-racism as a personal and professional priority. Number 3, educate yourself. Now, there are so many different things that you might educate yourself about, and there's a wealth of resources that existed before now, and many, many, many more have been generated in the past few weeks. It's actually pretty amazing. Challenge, of course, is you might feel overwhelmed. I would encourage you to turn to professionals in this area, to even ask them if they would curate, readings and different things for you to do. But even better than that is, as you go online, to look for sources that you deem as credible. I've listed one, which is the National Museum of African American History and Culture. They have a really solid new portal on learning about race. Number 4, work within your sphere of influence to advocate for change, as recommended on the preceding slide, and also to think about things such as sponsoring and implementing initiatives, events, programs. Also, within your sphere of influence, to hold peers accountable, or probably any number of things in terms of recognizing you all are in different roles in different sectors, but you have a sphere of influence no matter where you are on the org chart. You're probably familiar, number 5, practice the platinum rule. You're probably familiar with the golden rule, which is to treat others as you want to be treated. That's certainly one option for being inclusive. To value and respect persons who may have different views of how to respect them, the platinum rule may be more appropriate. And that is, treat others as they want to be treated. So understanding RESPECT, find out what it means to me, requires getting to know them well enough to understand what it means to them. And this can include, as you educate yourself, as you learn, for instance, what I just shared about the history of the term boy and why it matters, such that when that happens in a setting and someone says, well, what's the big deal? There's an understanding that this is not a unique instance. This stems from history. It's a way for you to really learn more in terms of practicing the platinum rule. And in fact, what can happen with the golden rule is it may be used as an excuse to treat others disrespectfully. Back again to that example about being called boy, or even the examples about being mistaken for someone else. I've heard people say, well, that wouldn't bother me, or I don't find that disrespectful, or what's the big deal? Well, it's because there's a different connotation and a painful one at that. Number 6, discover and value ways that coworkers are unique. Show genuine interest in learning who they are and help them to know you too. I think all of us don't want to be seen as just one or two aspects of our identity. And so especially try to ascertain unique attributes related to their role, right? So something that's actually job related. Finally, number 7, engage in affirming interactions. Affirming interactions refer to positive micro messages or micro affirmations to show others that you value and respect them. Please hear me. These are not a cure-all. They're not adequate at all for systemic change, but they offer a tangible, explicit way that you can apply immediately. Affirming interactions require attention to verbal and nonverbal cues, how you say, what your posture is like, and so forth. So consider the difference between if a person of color describes something that is painful for them or feels disrespectful or that they question, consider the difference between someone saying, why does that matter? To, why does that matter? The former implies that the speaker doesn't believe something matters. In fact, it's not even really a question, is it? Why does that matter? The latter implies a genuine curiosity. Why does that matter? An openness to learning something new. So these affirming interactions are not gratuitous. They are more than just being kind or nice. They have to be genuine, authentic, and thoughtful. Affirming interactions require you to be fully present, self-aware, vulnerable, willing to learn, and willing to admit mistakes. Microaffirmations can help to counteract the cumulative negative impact of microaggressions, those routine, daily ways that people say and do things that are derogatory and demeaning. However, we absolutely must also address microaggressions. So this notion of affirming interactions is one way to begin to cultivate a more inclusive, equitable, and anti-racist workplace. Now, to conclude the presentation, I want to go a bit into affirming interactions by showing this list of verbs that are ways to engage in affirming interactions. Take a moment to browse those. And can you see just by the verbs themselves, how they might guide ways you can engage in affirming interactions? As you look at them, which of those do you think Chancellor Harrell enacted in my opening story? Well, I think that she acknowledged, appreciated, respected, and valued me. She also tried to understand me. And I realized that as I reflected on it, I want to add another one to the list. She showed compassion. So here are a couple of ideas just to wrap up. That again are, I believe these affirming interactions are especially critical. They always have been, but especially today, as you think in particular about people of color, but also as you think about interacting with everyone in your workplace. Listen, believe, and trust. If someone describes to you something they're concerned about related to their identity, and again, let's foreground race, a person of color says this thing happened, and as a Latina, as a Native American, right? It made me feel this way. Start with, what if this is really true? Start with acknowledging and validating them. Another one is to be fully present. My gosh, being fully present is one of the best gifts. Did you get that? Present gifts. Yeah. Well, being fully present is really one of the best gifts that you can give someone. It shows that you value them. And also, being present, you might just realize that that person of color is Brenda J, and that other person of color is Polly, because you notice differences, right? You see them as a unique individual. Speaking of unique individuals, individuate. This means viewing people as individuals with unique attributes. And also, by the way, as we think about people of color, see them as unique, but also recognize that others may view them as monolithic. Also understand that for some of us, that aspect of our identity we value. I love being a Black woman. So I'm not saying don't see me as a Black woman. I'm saying see me as a Black woman who also is da 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 da. Okay. Just one more is to stand up for colleagues, but especially people of color, and particularly when you're in a position of power. But also if you're a bystander, gosh, aren't we seeing examples of how bystanders might have made a difference? Finally, invite input on initiatives related to their areas of expertise rather than just focusing on racial ethnic identity. I hope that these examples assist you with incorporating affirming interactions in the workplace, affirming anti-racist interactions in the workplace, equitable interactions in the workplace. Consider these and previous recommendations as you now strive to create a personal action plan. I'm gonna put that up there just for a moment. And I want you to think about, based on what we shared today, what will you do in order to try to affect change, in order to foster, cultivate more inclusive, anti-racist, equitable workplaces? I'm going to give you about 2 minutes to reflect on that. Okay, thank you. As we wrap up and go into the Q&A session, I want you to go back to the intention that you set for our time together and to just reflect, how well did you achieve that intention? And I say, how well did you achieve that intention? I also look forward to your feedback on this session. And I invite you, of course, I want to hear whatever you think went well, but I'm particularly interested, and again, now more than ever, with hearing from you in terms of what I might have done to improve this presentation to better serve you. All of us should be much more committed in terms of whatever our gifts and talents and expertise might be to help us really take advantage of this time in the world. I think all of us should be refining that and striving to do the very best that we can do. In conclusion, I encourage you to try to cultivate more inclusive, equitable, and anti-racist workplaces by applying the framework and suggestions we have explored today. Note that for most of what I share, there's a deeper, more complex and comprehensive wealth of information and insight. I just hope I've done them justice. Although your individual efforts alone will not achieve organizational transformation at the level we're talking about, to really move forward and to move forward and stay moved forward, they definitely can help. Minimally, you can help a coworker feel a momentary sense of being seen and valued, as Chancellor Harrell did for me in July 2016. So let's move now to a Q&A.
Perfect. So, Brenda, we do have quite a few questions. I want to thank you again for this wonderful presentation.
Hi.
Hello. Okay, so the first question we have for you, 11% of participants identify as directors or organizational leadership. What are some strategies you would suggest to engage colleagues in organizational leadership in a conversation and eventually taking action to advance racial equity?
Excellent question. As I alluded to, now is really the time for leaders to step up. So I first of all recommend, and perhaps I need to share the link with you. I wrote a brief piece for LinkedIn that talks about what it's about higher education leaders that I think actually ends up being relevant to all leaders. And it begins with those leaders themselves taking personal responsibility and moving beyond. We see in so many organizations, institutions, et cetera, where there's statements that amount to, we abhor the acts that have happened, we deepen our commitment, they relate to our mission, et cetera. But rarely have I read that leaders say specifically what they are doing. So I encourage leaders to, regardless of their racial identity, to actually make a commitment to learn more about racism, anti-racism, anti-Black racism, et cetera, to learn more, to share with others what they're learning, to do as a result of what they're learning. So whatever it means in terms of taking personal responsibility in that regard, because again, education and learning about best and promising practices are going to be crucial. Second, I encourage them, if I went back to the slide that talks about what to do at organizational levels, they talk about practices such as professional development. They talk about developing strategic plans. So those would be the kinds of things. And also you'll see in the resources, there's a list that actually provides a racial equity framework for organizations. Those are some things. Another idea is to engage in inclusive leadership training so that leaders become much better in terms of how they're leading for equity and inclusion. Those are just a few things that I can think of. And really, I'm willing to take a look at some of the resources that I have and maybe add something to the resources we're going to post on the site. Thanks.
Wonderful. Wonderful. I also think it's important. Elizabeth had written, my personal action will be to affirm all people, not just minorities, equip, empower, and encourage all of my staff to avoid some jokes that could exclude a particular group, ensure that all in my sphere of influence feel included and accepted, to take a more active role in mutual respect between myself, my staff, and the families we serve.
Thank you. That is wonderful. And I hope that part of what I shared today will guide you in that commitment. And I also encourage you to really notice how you feel. That's something that I didn't describe, but I know any efforts in which I strive to be compassionate towards people and I can see what it does for them, that makes me feel better too.
Yes. Okay, so next question is, what advice would you give a person of color on how to respond to racism in the workplace?
Oh my gosh, that is so hard. I think that for one, for others to understand that these kinds of both implicit and explicit examples of racism still are routine in lots of workplaces. And second, the more that others are committed to anti-racism, the better it's going to be for for persons of color in terms of what their experience might be. Now, to get to how to respond, there's no one answer because part of how to respond depends upon the context in which you are. That is, and it also depends upon what's the example, what happened that you believe is racist. That then can include talking to a supervisor about what happened, particularly if it feels like something that is at the level of being grievable. Most organizations have human resources offices. Many of them have actual anonymous tip lines where you can share what happened. If you have someone that you view as an ally, as a colleague that you could go and talk with about what happened. Or if it's something that is a one-on-one with someone where they might be open to you having a conversation with them, you can try that as well. But it's very, very difficult. And oftentimes, as I mentioned, even bringing it up, which is, by the way, another point, is really I've encouraged organizations to add race into conversations more. That I was so surprised with Chancellor Harrell because people in the institutions that I've been affiliated with and others won't even talk about race, right? It's like it's a taboo topic. In fact, I used to say to my colleagues on the executive team, race is not a four-letter word, right? They would want to use synonyms like culture, et cetera. So back to this person, there are any number of ways for you to approach this. I would hope that you have someone either in the organization or someone whom you trust who understands these dynamics that you can consult based on the particular type of occurrence of what you perceive to be racism.
Great. The next question we have is, how do you deal with leadership that is reluctant to engage in any training or discussion or reading regarding racism and inclusion in the workplace?
Oh my gosh.
Flat out refusal to engage in this work.
Yeah. You are, trust me, I totally understand what you're saying. And I understand it from the standpoint of being in organizations where those same leaders are, relatively good people, that they say they care about these issues. I cannot imagine how much harder it might be for those who really think that this is irrelevant and they shouldn't put their time and energy into it. To the question, I say seize this moment, that I believe many more people are going to be held accountable. I also encourage, though, in terms of how you persuade, is to try to figure out what matters most to them. More often than not, there is something within the mission, vision, and value that you can use as a hook. There's also, probably you're aware of, the arguments for diversity and inclusion are the bottom line. How would not engaging in this kind of training, et cetera, what might be the implications in terms of succeeding in your mission? Another one is, how would not engaging in this, how would that look for other people who are looking at your agency or looking at your organization to learn that the leader does not participate in that kind of development? So thinking about rationale, appealing to the why, also think about who can exert pressure, who might that person listen to? And another idea is, are there other leaders who might be engaged in such professional development and training that that person views as peers? And that you can either hold up to say, well, so-and-so's doing it, or you might get that person to help you get to that leader. Those are just some ideas. One of the things that's challenging for me in this kind of venue, even though there are things that I love, is that I would love to hear from others if they have ideas related to all of the questions that have been posed. Because certainly that question about getting leaders involved in this kind of training and professional development and taking a personal responsibility is huge. It's so significant. And it matters because oftentimes they think they know, they think, they think I'm good, I got this, right? And they typically don't. Most of us don't. There's so much to learn and so much to do. And second, their refusal then really does not give a very good, present a very good impression of whatever they're striving to do. So it really matters.
Absolutely. And I'm definitely happy as well. If people do want to have further discussion with you or have ideas, they can feel free to email the info@cebc4cw.org, and I can forward those on to you, Brenda.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yes. So it looks like we probably have time for about one more question. I had seen these a few times. How do you create a safe environment within the workplace in order to have these conversations about race and equity?
That's another excellent question. And thanks again to everyone who came today. I regret that I won't have time for all of your questions, and I appreciate the ones that I didn't get to. But to this question of providing a safe place, I would say strive to provide a safer space, and also enlist the assistance of extremely qualified, well-reputed facilitators to help in engaging in dialogues. I am so concerned. I'm hearing about organizations saying, we're going to invite all the Black people to come and talk to leadership. No, 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 right? That you really want to draw upon best and promising practices, and again, rely upon people who are facilitators who are known to do this work well. I'm very honored that the campus I used to work for, the University of Colorado Boulder, I've been invited to co-facilitate a session just for Black staff on that campus with another Black colleague that I've known for 30 years. And so we're going to provide that virtual space for reflection. And I know some organizations resist this idea of separating people by race or other identities. I think that done well, this can be very effective. And speaking of that, I would encourage to consider same race kinds of spaces with the facilitators of the same race. That's one way for safer. Also establish guidelines for how we agree that we're going to engage with one another. Be clear on the goals of what you're trying to do. And even to the extent of whether or not and how the facilitators will draw from what they've heard to help inform what the organization can do without ever revealing who said what. So again, excellent question, and certainly a way forward. And it's a way forward, not only in terms of anti-racism, but the other kinds of isms that pervade our society and our workplaces. Heteronormativity, ableism, nationality status, certainly gender, social class, etc. So that all of these matter, even as in this moment, I do think it's important to foreground racism while understanding that it can overlap and intersect with other aspects of identity and has implications, frankly, for all isms.
Thank you so much, Brenda. I think that will conclude their questions and the webinar. This was such an important webinar and very informative, and we are so grateful to you for taking the time.
Thank you. I am grateful for the opportunity. And everyone, peace be with you. Take good care of yourselves. Thank you for the extremely important work that you are doing. Bye-bye.
Thank you.